tonight we're very happy for the Singapore chapter to talk about smart city, and we're happy to start with introducing Jean-Christophe Bailly, a writer and philosopher who has devoted his work to urban space and the evolution of space. You might be familiar with le dépaysement or la phrase urbaine. Jean-Christophe is going to develop some concepts from which later on our panel will discuss, shake, enlarge, to draw some leads on how smart should a city be to increase human well-being. Jean-Christophe, please, the stage is yours.
Good evening. First, I would like to apologize for the way I'm pronouncing English, which is sometimes very strange for myself, probably for you. And second thing is that smart city, when I heard of this in Paris, only one way to understand it, which was to keep the word smart in a sense which is quite generic, quite different from what it involves through technology and so on. And obviously I could not speak about a city I didn't know, Singapore, but I tried to write to present something which could be of interest in order to introduce a proper debate. Every city, even small, is a complex city. A rich and tangled ball made of a multiplicity of threads, some of them quite visible, others rather secret. Related to the long history of man, the birth and development of the cities are recent. But if we consider them on another scale, they form a very long process, full of stations and detours, and this process has reached now a point of no return. As you know, more than half of human beings, and it's recent, more than half of human beings are living today in urbanized spaces or landscapes. And this enjoins us to define again what a city is or could be. Obviously, this irreversible growth cannot be considered as a simple increase. It leads to other changes, to new forms of spaces, new forms of movements and exchanges. But these new forms are far away from being achieved. First, because the development of any urban process, any urban system is an endless process. And second, because we are not in front of something legible, something where it would be possible to recognize an integrated and well-composed landscape. Everybody knows that it would be rather the opposite. From here, from this place where we are at this moment, Singapore, from such a modern, active, inventive city is almost difficult to imagine. But what first characterizes our time is the very problematical situation of the human settlements everywhere. Uncontrolled growth, disorder, anxiety. Too often there is no other answer to this spectacular and frightening urban and suburban quantities than a mixture of carelessness and bureaucratic improvisation, without speaking of all the repressive forms which maintain misery and violence. Everything is more or less as if the city as a coherent, intentional and delimited whole, as if the city had exploded, giving place to a kind of universal suburb. Not the specified suburbs we have known in the industrial age, but a wider and more disjointed landscape where the reference points used by people and the legibility of the urban text and context tend to disappear. This situation, obviously, different from one place to another, doesn't automatically turn into an apocalyptic mode. And imaginative solutions are generated here and there, sometimes with a great spreading effect. But the major aspect remains the one of a chaos. based on some spectacular images of this chaos, the theory of the emerging city has attempted to describe it, the chaos, as a field of new opportunities. It could be real. On the opposite side, another recurrent attitude consists in a purely nostalgic feeling which looks only in the direction of a so-called achievement of the cities of the past. For me, both directions are wrong. On one hand, the actual dispersion of the urban form doesn't mean that the spatial attempts and solutions of the former cities are obsolete. And on the other hand, the spatial patterns of the city making have not at all to be understood like straitjackets or normative rules. It's reverse. And what we can see if we look deeply towards history is the fact that only a permanent change is able to keep the structural permanences alive. It sounds like a paradox, but it's just the way it goes. And to look at the reliability of this trans-historical affiliation is really impressive. One of the most convincing progression is a constant need for void, the necessity of maintaining empty places in order to ensure the relations between the buildings, between the people, between the forms. The spacing is the first and most important feature of any architectural or urban composition, and it would be a great thing to examine the ways it has been crossing from the beginning until now. It would be hard, actually, to find a trace of human settlement based on no matter how or no matter where. At any place, on every site, we find the beginning of a spatial organization, a distribution, a rhythmical purpose, a symmetry, a device of spacings and volumes. And this is something we cannot forget, something which should work constantly in our minds as soon as we think of a city, as soon as we walk in its streets, as soon we begin to consider it in terms of intelligence and intelligibility. The network of the streets, squares and passages, the dimensions of the public open spaces, the echoes between the spatial landmarks, the coherent choices of scales, the balance between city and what still can be called nature through landscape design activity and more than that, all these points work together and are part of the whole challenge. One thing is to invent a contour. Another thing is to open it. One thing is to initiate a new form. Another thing is to link it to the surrounding elements which already exist or which are planned. The urban landscape, when it works, when it does actually performs its virtues, can be described like the proper integrated form of a connected or a connecting system. It's for this reason that we have to learn from all the places all over the world where such connected systems are working or have been working. The scales could be very different, and the technological level and the forms of life involved in the city making too. The extended catalogue of spatial solutions which maintain and increase what we can call, using the philosophical sense of the word, the open. The extended catalogue of the open is large and works like a foliation of keywords. The bridge, the door, the window, the gate, the passage, the threshold, the alley, the street, the square, big, very big, small, very small, the stairs, the entrance, the way out, and so on. All these keywords designate simultaneously a very concrete thing and the local mode of the precise moment of a general opening process. Generic, this process becomes true through its permanent and always renewed actualization. The passers-by, as they are, as they walk and go, are the authors and the producers of this becoming true. We can consider every city like a book, an open book, both written and read at the same time. A book which remains secret but which is also clear and obvious. A book which is unpredictable, but which is familiar. The passers-by are the readers of this immense text, and they are all different, the passers-by. This means that every reading is different and is a new interpretation. The ability of a city to produce this extended way of reading or writing or walking here, reading, writing or walking are quite similar. This ability is the first and most important quality. This comparison between city and language, I've working a lot on trying to extract all what I could from this comparison. This comparison between city and language is, I think, far from being an abstraction, far from being a purely theoretical device. What we can call a sentence, an urban sentence, an urban phrase, has to work like a proper sentence. It means a construction which is an articulation of different elements, names, verbs, adjectives, and so on. Each of those elements related to the surrounding other elements. And we have seen all over the world so many bad constructions where the elements, instead of being connected by the structural process, remain separated. Piles of names here, piles of verbs there, piles of adjectives somewhere else, and so on. This art, the art of connecting and spacing, is the strongest support, I think, of the legibility of the urban landscape. But there is something else, and it will be my conclusion for the moment. There's something else we must keep in mind, and it is the special mode of this actions of reading. Actions of reading. Reading is not at all passive for me. Even if the structural patterns or the formal arrangement of the sentences are almost the same everywhere, the language that each city produces is different. There is indeed what I try to call, and I don't know if it's a good expression, but there is indeed a mystery of the local tonality. And we can feel it both as visitors and inhabitants. This tonality that we can feel as soon as we arrive or come back in a city is what we miss first when we are away. And this tonality, this special mode of being itself behind contrast and innovations, is not only the result of something realized in the past, by the past. It proceeds from a permanent work, the work that the city exerts on itself. The big or the global city, or the small one, every city and every part of the city is concerned by this exercise. This exercitation, exercitation, is an old French word used by Montaigne, and it's the transformation of an exercise into experience in a way. There is today, as we know, a strong impulse toward bigness and impersonal compromise. But on the other hand, there is also on the opposite side of a wide range of urban wishes on wheels, a great fascination for ancient traditional areas, which may turn them into kind of touristic trap. The proper language of the city is neither of them. It has to be reinvented constantly, and the range of means and resources we can use is big and goes far beyond the limited areas of each speciality. Global and local are two words we still have to understand and complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. So I'm gonna just call our few panelists to join us on stage, please. I would like to welcome Thomas Schropfer. You're a professor at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, STUD. Your area of expertise is a complex relationship between design and technology in architecture. You're working as well on different development projects in Singapore. We'll be very happy to share a bit more of that with you later. Jean-François Milou, thanks to you, we had the Supreme Court and the CTO reinvented, joined, and transformed into the superb National Gallery, which has been inaugurated a bit more than a year ago. It's a must to visit for whoever hasn't done yet. You founded the architecture agency Studio Milou and working on various projects still in the city-state and outside as well. Thank you very much for being with us. Adib Jalal, we're very happy you're with us tonight. A few days ago, you were serving your country as a reservist still, so we're very lucky. You're an architect and co-founder of the studio Shophouse & Co. I see your other co-founder here on the first, where at Shophouse & Co. you do both strategy and program intervention to help people understanding planning and their building. Please join us. And last but not least, Axel Gelfert, you're a professor and philosopher of science at the National University of Singapore in US. And with you, I'm sure we're gonna talk about the aspects, limits, ethics of the tech some smart cities would be tempted to deploy. I have to say, when we talk about smart cities, you have to know, I mean, probably most of you know, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has deployed a big smart city plan last year. It's a 10-year plan, right? Where Singapore is supposed to become the smart city. And when we talk about smart cities in Singapore, it's a lot about tech. What the five of you have in common, it's each time we started to talk together, you're like, yes, 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 but it's not only about the tech. There's a lot of hype behind the word smart city. So can I start with asking you in a few words, I know it's a complex exercise, I forgot the name from Montaigne,
Exercitation.
Exercitation. But please, can we just maybe start with you, Axel? What, in a few words, would a smart city be according to you?
Yeah, as you said, it's a very difficult question to answer in a nutshell. I think one way to think about smart cities is to move from talking about what they are as an ontological question to what functions they serve. So, I mean, typically we are familiar all, I think, in public discourse with smart cities being defined as cities that are basically operating on digital information that's being collected through sensors, so that we have different technological layers stacked on top of the existing infrastructure. And that's typically how it's communicated in technological writing. We have basically this infiltration of modes of measuring and gaining information about movements as well as places and the environment in the city. But I think that's really not so helpful to think about smart cities. What I think is helpful is to think about what functions typically are associated with smart cities. And so I think there are a range of functions one can identify. There's the function of making existing municipal services more efficient. That's how it's always sold, as efficient gains in efficiency. But of course there are further functions, for example, political functions, to integrate city governance better across different levels. Not just in a geographical way, but according to sort of responsibilities and competencies. And then there are broader societal functions which are often left out, which I think are going to be crucial. For example, that smart cities should really be aiming for and managing and enabling citizen participation. But it seems to me that a lot of technological discourse about smart cities really reduces citizens to basically sources of data. Citizens are being seen as sensors of sorts, and they're not really seen as sort of citizens in the full exercise of their autonomy, making an input, giving substantive views on important issues. So I think more needs to be done in the smart cities discourse to really talk about citizens as participating in democratic participation. That's sorely lacking, I think, in the technology-centered discourse of smart cities.
I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about it even later, but thanks a lot. Jean-François Milou, what would be the main aspect for you, or one of the main aspects for you in a smart city should show?
I think we should be driven, actually. What I can say is we should be driven in thinking of what is smart, is to be driven by what we like. And I think what we like as individuals is to see the different layers in the city, to be articulated in a playful and very legible, funny, playful, I don't know what, manner. And when the landscape, the heritage, the new technology, the new way of designing space are woven together in a delicate, sensitive way. I think people like it, and it's smart. That's it.
Thomas? What do you
so I'm going to stick to my one sentence definition. Smart cities is where smart people live, right? I mean, it's a bit provocative, of course. And of course, you know, I agree with a lot of what Axel has said about this kind of technocentric definition of what it means to have a smart city, right? But this simple sentence, smart cities is where smart people live. I mean, it hints to the fact that ultimately, you know, we can collect data and so on. And of course, the possibilities that we have nowadays, they're in many respects, they are unprecedented, right? I mean, what we can do nowadays probably wasn't possible just a couple of years ago. But what we do with this kind of data, how we enable citizens to participate, for example, or how we make cities more livable for ourselves and future generations, I think that has to be at the core of all of this exploration, because ultimately technology is just a tool, right? I mean, it's not going to lead by itself to better cities. So there's an element of design, of planning, of engineering that has to come into the picture. And of course, there has to be a very responsible use of data, because data is just data, it's raw material. You can use it for the benefit of a city, or you can use it to make things a lot worse. So I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you very much. And Adib, what do you think? In a few words also for you, and you've been...
We've seen everything. At least to me, smart cities is really about using information and knowledge, and really how do we use this to create places for people. The idea of being smart, I think cities have always been smart since centuries ago. Oral traditions, you know, what we call now primitive technology. Technology has always been there. It's just that the tools have gotten so sophisticated right now that we can crunch large amounts of data and globally and networks, right? But at the core of it, like what has been mentioned just now, I think it's really just a tool for us to make our lives better in cities. And how do we get people involved in it, creating better lives for our families, for our future generations? I think that's what smart city is all about. Yeah.
Brilliant. If we start with writing a city, as Jean-Christophe was saying, how should we write a smart city? How should we build a smart city to be sure that we're going to really something which is going to be even better than the places we're living in right now? Maybe we can start with Thomas. Is there a right balance to find?
I think there's a right balance to find. I mean, of course, you know, putting together a city, there's so many levels to it, right? And maybe I can share, we just had the opportunity to work on a 64-hectare new city district here for Singapore, which is something that we propose to be realized in the next 20 years, maybe. So there we had to think about all these various aspects, and of course, a very interdisciplinary endeavor, right? I mean, you need planners, you need consultants of all sorts, you need social science, you need people from essentially all the different areas that make up a city, right? And what we did in this context is we also ran a couple of community design workshops, which is very interesting, because we as kind of trained designers, trained engineers, we have certain ideas about what the future city should look like. But of course, it's a good check, right, to go out to the future inhabitants of the city and see, is it actually in line with what people would like to see to happen in a future city, right? I think what we're aiming for in our particular project is a certain level of urban intensity. We're very interested in a city that juxtaposes different aspects. I think a city should not be too homogeneous. I think it should be full of contrasts that make it interesting. Of course, life is something you cannot design, right? I mean, you can just allow a framework to be in place and hope for the best to happen.
Adib, do you think a city, because here, I mean, a lot of us have been living for a long time in Singapore, it constantly changes. It's crazy. It's always moving. Is it what a city should be doing to become smarter and smarter?
I think it's always nice to find that balance, right? You got to keep reinventing yourself and make it fresh and absorb new ideas. I think that's the beauty of cities, where you get to absorb all these influences and technological advances, society, but at some point you got to find that balance, because if it changes too fast, you almost lose that sense of identity, right? You lose your grounding. It's like, and you go back and you forget your roots even. So I think it's important for cities to constantly evolve, and I think that's the way cities should be. But what's that balance? Again, just like what Thomas shared just now, right? I think there is a way to find that balance. There is a right kind of balance, but how do we get there? Yeah.
Jean-Christophe, you're a passerby, right? You're a walker. You love walking in cities, and you've been walking for the last 2 days, right?
Yeah.
What did you see here which you liked? I think you were.
It's very weird because I'm here since 3 days and people like 10 years, all his life. And so what can I say? Also, in order to have a difference, for example, I read a text by an Italian writer, a woman called Anna Maria Ortese, and she arrived in Paris in the 50s, and she was there for a few days, and really she wrote the best text on Paris in the 50s I've ever read. And a lot of Parisians, they never, not even saw what she's talking about. Well, I'm not Anna Maria Ortese, I just can give some impressions. But if I try to relate these impressions to what we're talking about, for me the most impressive feeling I have here is a difference, the way the very different scales are working together. Because the first impression you have is the skyline and all these buildings, and in a way, as somebody was traveled a lot, or a little bit disappointed. It's just that. No, it's not just that. And if you look at your feet, you see something completely different, which is not the feet of those skyscrapers, but an horizontal organization. And I feel, for example, that this ochre food places, it's very interesting because it's not purely tradition. It's a translation of a traditional way of working together in something which can cope with the past and with the present, obviously with the future. This is what I'm feeling. This is what I feel, and I could say the same thing with what is concerns the relationships between the green and the grey, if you want. And today, this afternoon, I went and I saw these buildings, not the Oasian, the other one, the Park Royal, I think. Yeah. And I was very impressed because in France we have a lot of, we try to do such thing, but it's not the same scale, not the same purposes even. But it's very impressive because at first I'd say it works. But it works not only because it's an architectural object, it works because it's surrounded with other trees also. Sure. It's not a lonely object. And I saw some things which are too much like lonely objects too in these 3 days, but it's obviously a general problem, a world architectural problem.
Jean-François Milou, you've been an architect here for quite a number of years. Would you say that this because all these layers going together, and there's one dimension which is vertical, right? We're talking about a city which is chasing for space all the time, continuously, and basically architects went up. Are you impressed by what your colleagues here in Singapore are doing in terms of verticality in architecture?
Level of the architectural practice in Singapore is very impressive. I think what they have been able to achieve is this not perfect, this integration of the landscape into the architecture, and this kind of reflection about how to do it. And I think on that, Singapore is at the forefront of that kind of weaving of nature and architecture. That's just a fact.
Is it Thomas, a big challenge for Singapore to show its leadership in in this domain, in this field, and is it a big challenge for the city itself to manage to build city vertically, and is it also a big challenge for the city to show the leadership?
I think the challenge in the Singapore context is how do you produce a denser city, because the population is growing, and at the same time maintain a certain level of livability, right? Because Singapore was always a green city from the get-go, and in recent years the paradigm of the city is being a city in the garden, right? But how do you achieve being a city in a garden when you build buildings that are 40, 50, 60 stories high, right? And of course, Singapore, being an island with no hinterland, there's only so much space you have, right? So the only dimension that is at your disposal is the vertical one, right? And I think over the last maybe 1 decade, one can see more and more interesting experiments happening here that are kind of exploring what that could mean, right? To have a truly vertical city. And it's not just having greenery, you know, in the section of the building, but it's also about public space in the sky. I think there's some really remarkable examples here, like the Pinnacle at Duxton is a quite early one, where there's a very large kind of public space, very high up in the building, connecting a number of high-rise buildings.
You even have a jogging track, right?
Yes,
in the middle of the year.
A jogging track. But I think it goes beyond the architectural scale. It ultimately is an urban design question also. And a lot of the leading offices that are engaging in this discourse, they're also thinking about the city, right? And what that could mean for a city, and if this could indeed work. Of course, Singapore is in a way blessed with a very good leadership, you know, in that respect. So the government agencies, they do their part in incentivizing this kind of development. So for example, if you put green space, let's say a sky garden or something like that in your building, essentially you get that area for free. So in other words, when you're a developer and it's all about the bottom line, you can do that, you actually get a bigger building in return and a more attractive building in return. And I think it's, you know, it's the kind of pushing of the agencies or the pulling of the agencies with these incentives, and at the same time the experimentation of some of the very creative leading architectural and urban design practices here in Singapore that put this on the forefront, I would say, of global development. Maybe I can mention in this context, not too long time ago there was a special edition of Architecture and Urbanism titled Singapore Capital City of Vertical Green. So the city really wants to pitch itself, you know, as exactly that, being dense, being urban, but at the same time green and livable. I mean, just think about Terminal 3 at Changi Airport, right? I mean, it's the same ideas, and now with the Jewel coming up, the new building in Changi, it'll be an even kind of more extreme version of a kind of a merging of architecture and landscape.
Can you give us a bit of examples, because we're broadcasting globally, so lots of people don't know. Maybe there's a butterfly space at the airport.
Yeah. So essentially, the Jewel, which is not built yet, but will be an addition to Changi Airport, which is a very big airport in this part of the world. It'll feature essentially an interior botanic garden, if you want. And it'll speak about this idea to be a city in a garden, right? So everybody who passes through Singapore or who has to wait for a flight can experience this kind of atmosphere, right? This kind of, it's very artificial, but at the same time it's also very, very much about nature. So it's a very interesting combination of landscape and architecture and urban design that is happening here.
And Adib, I think you wanted also to say that a smart city, or a city to be smart, shouldn't be forgetting about inclusivity.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in using all these smart technologies to make the city even more inclusive. And I think we chatted about this just now and earlier today, is that technologies such as self-driving cars, right? I mean, you could actually recontextualize that and make the city even more accessible to people who have mobility challenges. For once, they could actually travel around the city and actually experience the city in a different way. technologies like AR and VR, right? You actually open up a whole new range of possibilities for people who might have been challenged or not included in our conversation on the city, and get them experiencing it and get them contributing to it. Digital platforms, for example. The beautiful thing about digital platforms is that there's a very low barrier to entry, and I think that could be a way for us to include even more people in conversations about what a city could be and what it should be even. Yeah, and that's an opportunity I think a lot of the speakers would agree that that's one way to make our cities even smarter than we are now.
Do you have a few examples in mind? Some things in your mind that would make life really better for lots of people who are outside of
one of the examples that I read, I can't remember which European country was a dementia village that actually leverages an RFID tags so that they could actually be tracked around, right? That's a very simple way. As humans, we need to keep track of people who are challenged, right? And through very simple use of current technology, nothing too advanced, we could actually help them and navigate their way through. So that's a very simple way of seeing how our city could become smarter. It's not about the latest technology, but about the smart use of technology. I think that's a difference.
We'll go, I guess, a little bit more in depth a bit later on with the tech. Just before, Jean-Christophe, when we talk about a city which is vertical, I guess it's not the only model, right, for city development. What kind of other clever model of city we can start to witness around the world?
There is a lot of models, but what is interesting is not the model as a model, is the fact that the model is a response to a problem, which is here the fact we don't have the possibility of spoiling the space like in other places. And for example, in the past, in France, the city of Lyon was at its time a vertical city. Yes, all the areas where there was a work for the textile, there were, and it's very impressive still today when you walk in. No more industry in those places, but for the 18th century or beginning of 19th century, the buildings were very, very high, and it was an answer to a real problem, both a problem, also a problem because the machines for the textiles, they were very high. So the level of and so on and so on. And the response was urbanistic, architectural of interest, but it had, as he said, Axel, a function. See, you cannot work vertical for verticality like itself. Maybe it has been done. Maybe why New York is so vertical, the first vertical city in the world, the oldest vertical city, no green. But also New York is interesting also because of, not because of the verticality, but because of the relationship between verticality and Central Park. This makes it's always complicated. And some places we have seen, for me in Paris, La Défense is an example, a very bad example of the verticality for the verticality. We have to be vertical because, well, why? And the great pleasure I had as a city, as a promeneur, or the promenade in Russia, St. Petersburg, the flattest city in the world, and completely flat. And as if the city, the builder of the city, and it's a monument of the city with awful memory of terrible things and so on. But the fact is so flat, it gives the impression that the city is a proper answer to the bigness of the space, in Russian space. The city has listened to the country where it was built, in a way. That's the most important. You have to listen the place, the site where you are. And here, the verticality is an answer. For this reason, it's very interesting. But it has to be, as they say, it has to be
let's say, okay.
Livable.
Right.
Huh?
Livable is the
Livable, yes.
Yeah. What are the limits of this model, for example? Because it's a model which will answer a lot of Asian challenges, right? A lot of Asian cities are going to suffer of high density, and they're gonna maybe follow, and they're looking already at Singapore as an example. But what are the main? I'm thinking about sustainability. Maybe after we can evoke some other questions with Jean-François we talked before. In sustainability, for example, how does it make it more fragile to have a vertical city, or better? I don't know.
Want to talk about it?
I think we can start with
No, but okay. It's obvious that this kind of dream of something, you know, very big, you know, it's a kind of I mean, men are talking a lot about it, women a bit less. So I don't know. I think there is a risk that it will not work. It's true. Meaning, we have to assess the way cities work, not only in this kind of situation of comfort, easiness, and so on, but you see in many places, you see civil unrest, crisis, and so on, and I think it's totally idealistic to think that it will not happen, even in a high density, beautiful garden city in some time. So we should be very, very cautious. I think that's my opinion. Huh? And I think we should build the city bit by bit and progress progressively, and not try to have vision which are a bit. And at the end of the day, it's a kind of delirium. It can be, you know, we have to be cautious. The quality of the city which works and which are smart, they have been built slowly and progressively, and with a lot of sensitivity. And I think without that, it will not work.
Actually, if I can just follow up on that, I think it's a very important point, and the fact that you brought up sustainability shows that, you know, how we think about smart cities really relates to what kinds of values we want cities to embody. So, I mean, earlier you asked how do we build smart cities. I mean, if one, from a casual sort of survey of the way that it's talked about, it seems to me that there are two ways in which this is done. Either you create smart cities from scratch. Sometimes, you know, as in some case of some countries, I think in India, Prime Minister Modi had said he wants to build 100 smart cities from scratch. Well, you know, that's a bold statement. It needs to be filled with meaning. But wherever it's been tried to and attempted to build cities from scratch, we face these challenges, as with La Défense, or you know, in Seoul, we have smart districts being added on to the city. But to fill them with life and activity and get people, as you said, smart cities are places where smart people live. That takes time, and that can't be forced. And so the other option to build smart cities is to try to make existing cities smarter. And that's where I think many of the real challenges lie. I mean, that's what we, of course, see when we look around. That's what we see in the case of Singapore, that there's the challenge. We have a formidable task maintaining infrastructure and then making that infrastructure smart. And it requires basically grafting on top of existing infrastructure new technological systems. And they're often based on sensors, they're based on information. This requires a lot of fine tuning, as we've seen with the MRT system, where it takes sometimes months to work out the glitches when something goes wrong. So this isn't easy work. And there, another challenge is to maintain then the kinds of values that we really cherish. Because it's, I think, tempting for many cities, maybe less so for Singapore, because the government has a lot of control about many aspects of the economy and the country at large, but in other cities to simply then sell off parts of the city to the private sector. So I think there's a real question that needs to be asked when we talk about values, not just about what values do we want architects to embody. Sustainability sounds great, it's a placeholder that means many things to many people. But rather real hard questions of political economy.
What happens when we have an existing infrastructure of a cash-strapped city, so not Singapore, let's take a city in my hometown like Berlin, doesn't have a lot of money. They might bring in some external investor, and then that investor is adding smart technology to an existing infrastructure in exchange for, of course, collecting data. And then we've got, of course, a whole host of problems of privacy, ownership of data, legal issues, moral issues. Do we really want to track everyone? Do we just want to track the people who are handicapped? Why don't we just track everyone? I read in preparation for this event, I watched a few YouTube video with Vivian Balakrishnan, and he said in passing a statement that, we want to make commuting at MRT stations easier, so we provided Wi-Fi access at platforms. And then we realized, he said verbatim, we know every phone that is using the service, so we can create heat maps of activity. And of course, if we know every phone in Singapore on an MRT stop, then of course it's tempting to see where do people go and what do they use it for. Just to add one more example to that, Uber, the car mobility provider, whose basic model is to try to kill off the taxis around the world and move in as a low-cost, kind of low protections kind of provider of mobility, is now basically offering its own mobility data to cities. It's a sort of public-private partnership. Sounds great. A lot of cities want that data. But think about this. As of last year, or last month, I think, Uber is tracking all its users 5 minutes past the moment they leave a car. Of course, to figure out where there are the best pickup spaces, and so they get a map of where to direct drivers. But if that data is then taken and sold off, or made accessible even in aggregate form to cities or city governments, there are real questions to be asked about. Do we value efficiency so much that we want to basically sacrifice privacy, the anonymity of big cities that makes cities so attractive? I read a very nice quote by an urban designer, Dan Hill, who lives in Italy, was quoted in the Boston Globe, I think he said, that essentially, he said, efficiency isn't the reason we like to live in cities, and it's not the reason we visit them. It's because we have historically grown rich urban textures that Jean-Christophe talked about, that we really want to value, and that's not easily created overnight.
It's not so difficult either. As an architect, I must say it's not so difficult to weave all these values together because they are here. You just have to open your eyes. And it's not to bring a system or to bring, but that's what I want to say. Just there are many things in any situation. In any situation, you can recognize and use to create, let's say, beauty, or to create harmony, or to create something people will like. Meaning, the solutions are there sometimes. It's not only by having a kind of good idea. No. Everything is already there. You just have to. It's like cooking, You just have to cook with what you have in your fridge, and that's what is a good cook. In fact, sometimes,
But just one final point is, that came to my mind when you talk about sustainability, that the solutions and sort of embodiments of certain values are there. I agree entirely. But it's also, and that sometimes again gets left out because it's a question of political economy and the cost associated with building new infrastructures, that we need to always look at, in my opinion, in a way, how do these solutions scale up? It's one thing to have a wonderful national library that has eco standards and the low energy building, fantastic. But if you have one such building and then every week a mall opens that has air conditioning blasting out of the open doors onto the street that has absolutely no energy plan whatsoever, then of course that existence of a solution is purely symbolic. And that, I think, is a huge challenge that I as a layperson see in urban design. How do we scale up these solutions? Rebuilding infrastructures, as Singapore's beginning experience, is really, really difficult. There are all these lock-in effects that you can't undo. So making that, scaling up these solutions to a level where they can actually address the real issues of sustainability and so forth, I find is sometimes underestimated. It's great to have a proof of principle that we can do it once, but we need to do it essentially everywhere. We need to have low carbon technologies and all these things. Otherwise, we're just not going to have sustainability. It's as simple as that.
I think, Thomas, you were talking about another great example as well, right? About the Oasian Tower. Now you need to monitor, you start to place sensors. How is technology helping in building?
That is a research project that we're doing right now, where probably for the first time we try to verify, these statements done by architects and urban designers that these buildings do a lot of wonderful things, right? But to the extent of our knowledge, there's actually no one has actually measured, right, these effects, and no one has really closely observed, are these spaces that are somewhere up, in the building section, are they used the same way spaces on the ground floor are used, right? So I think we have to be skeptical also about that, while we also see the potential of all of these things. I think the point that Axel raised is, of course, a very important one, that we cannot stop at building showcase projects, right, that have everything kind of sustainability technology in them. But I think that's also not the case, really. Let's say you talk about the context of Singapore. There's a very ambitious sustainable Singapore blueprint that came out in 2015 that essentially articulates nationwide targets, right, and quantifies these targets, what they want to achieve by 2030, right? So I think that, how you refurbish existing structures, be they HDB blocks and so on here in the context of Singapore, I think that is an area of a lot of research in this part of the world, and probably also in other parts of the world, because ultimately 99% of what's built is already there, right? And there's only a few things that we add, after time. So I think it's a very important point that you raised. But an issue, let's say in the Singapore context, would be mobility, right? Is a very important thing to discuss. And of course, you want to go away from the use of cars, right, in cities. But the problem is, I think you hinted at that as well, there's all these kind of lock-in effects, right? I mean, it's a city that works wonderfully when you have a car, right? But once you have all that infrastructure in place, it's actually not so trivial to change it to a city that is all about pedestrians or bicycles and so on. But it's possible, right? I mean, we've seen it in the context of New York, for example, where nobody would have believed that Times Square could be what it is today, right, just a couple of years ago. So I think as long as there's a kind of a societal and political will to do this, it should be possible. Yeah, I'm actually more optimistic about this.
So mobility is one of the challenges. And is there something, because we were all describing Singapore a little bit earlier, is there something you think you should think Singapore should bring back in the smart city? You were talking about different elements, and if I'm not wrong, you were saying maybe the sea should have a bit more space. Jean-François, what do you think?
Yeah, I think really that I'm not talking as to build city as a kind of fabric. Let's say. I'm more talking at building a city like a kind of a collage of things. And I think what really is really lacking in Singapore today, my feeling is the feeling that the geographical landscape is part of the feeling of the city. You don't see the sea in Singapore, for example, and to be able to be on the seashore is really something Singapore should really aim for. I mean, that's very important. At night, you don't go and have a drink on to the seashore of Singapore, right? Except if you're in West Coast or this kind of thing. But that's really something. I think that to have the asset of the site, of the nature and so on, should be used more as an asset for the place. Imagine Singapore with a very large square opening to the sea with cafe everywhere, trees and so. When thousands of will come to have an ice cream at night, it's very, very easy to do, but it doesn't happen.
So
and that's a very simple thing to make the city much, much better. But it's there, but no one seems to see it. You know what I mean? That's what I say.
Adib, I think you're involved in a lot of consultation with people, right? We see that there's the challenge of mobility. There are some landscape challenges as well. How people do express how they want their city to be, and who is in control? Is, as Axel was saying, there's a movement we should be very aware of. Be careful with taking power in the city, in the smart city. But so, how the people do make their voice heard, and how people in power or can reply to them.
I think it's a very interesting thing that you just mentioned there, because in Singapore, at least, I would say that the idea of a ground-up movement is coming up strongly, especially in the last 2-3 years, where there's a lot of ground-up movements such as the Rail Corridor, right? That started from the Heritage Society and the Nature Society that really said something and said, this, we have a say, we want to shape how this thing's going to look like. And that affected the whole competition that went along, right? We have things like the Edible Garden City, right, who started to colonize all the various rooftop spaces, right, really promoting urban farming. We have participatory designers coming up, even like my own studio, right, we start to engage the residents and say, look, there's another way to plan, there is another way to make buildings, there's another way to activate our cities by listening to them. It's not that whatever the public says we absorb, but at least, like I say, it's a check, we are consulting, we are listening, and to test our own assumptions, because often when you're in power, you tend to think that there's only one right way to do it, and it's your own value system. But how do you then negotiate this? And I think that's a skill that I think Thomas also mentioned with your project, right? You got to engage the people and listen, and technology has enabled us to do that from all the social networks, for example. And even in Singapore, I'm sure most of you would have noticed that the government is starting to listen, and people start to value consultation a lot more. In fact, just over the weekend, I was involved in a heritage consultation exercise with the Heritage Board, where we're starting to have that conversation. How do we integrate things like Internet of Things technology into heritage conservation? How can we involve the community to make our cities more memorable and meaningful? Or even whose job is it? Is it just the boards? Is it just the government agencies? Or do we empower the volunteers? Or do we just open it up for a private developer to take ownership of these heritage spaces and trust them to protect these spaces? So I think it's a very interesting dynamics in Singapore right now, that there's a lot of change, and we're trying to figure out what's that model that works, especially for a country that's been quite known, to be honest, about how we've been very efficient doing things over the past 50 years, but it's a nice change at least. And I'm very positive about where this is going to go. I'm sure Thomas would agree with me. I was talking about students just now.
Can tech excel? Would tech help normal citizens taking more space in the sphere of power in a smart city? Can it be possible? Do you see it happening?
I think it is possible, of course. I mean, technology can be put to many uses. There are, various aspects to it. I mean, you mentioned, consultations. I assume these are sort of face-to-face consultations, in the style of, deliberative democracy, and I'm all in favor of it, and that's of course a good thing. But I think when we talk about smart cities in this sort of generic way, what's often as an idea behind this label of smart cities is a different form of consultation, and that is basically the kind of automated sort of feedback that comes with, basically data being gathered about citizens where they are, so that in the ideal utopian vision, a smart city can essentially already predictively guess what its citizens want and then provide those services. But that, of course, is a much more problematic way of thinking about the role of citizen, because it essentially reduces the citizen to the function of a sensor and something which stands in need of optimization. It was a very nice quote that I think Rem Koolhaas asked, why do smart cities only offer improvement? Where is the possibility of transgression? So you're actually changing the system in radical ways. If it's just about optimizing the existing system, of course, that would be one thing. So I think technology must conceive or must factor in the active role of engaged citizens. And that's where it comes down to the question of values again. Do we want citizens of cities to just be sort of consumers and producers of data that is then passively gathered and aggregated? Or do we want citizens to be engaged? Do we want, as Thomas put it, smart cities to have smart, engaged inhabitants? Of course, I guess most of us in the room would agree that's what we are aiming for. And getting technology to achieve that is a lot more difficult. So I think it's possible, but one has to guard against all sorts of distortions. I mean, consultation, for example, via technology through smartphone apps, online things is a nice step in the right direction, but there's also the worry about, are we being inclusive enough at that level? Isn't that just selectively privileging the input of early adopters, those who already have access to the technology? And it may be, they may have the interest at heart of the vulnerable, of the marginalized, of those who don't have access to technology because they don't have the money, or because they work 14 hours a day and can't afford to go online, download an app, and feed back things to the Heritage Board. So there needs to be, I think, an active effort to really, and not just in a sort of paternalistic way, do things for the marginalized communities, but actually be engaged. Actually go out there not to convince the public of the need of smart cities, but to have and cultivate, the virtues of engaged participatory citizenship, even when this doesn't fit with some officially approved narratives and goals.
And just to add on to that, I think it's more than just citizens being like data producers or giving data so that some algorithm can calculate or predict what's necessary. But there's also a danger that decision makers start to hide behind the data and they don't take responsibility, because there's an ethics behind coding, right? Somebody actually wrote that code. Somebody decided that that was the best way to calculate that decision. So if we start to delegate responsibility of decision making to all this data, I think we need to be aware of that and start to ask ourselves, who's making the decisions for all our planning reasons? Who's making the decisions for heritage conservation, for even citizen engagement, or what Alex said, right? But I think that is that ethical question, or even a leadership question, about how do we balance what the data tells us and where does the human decision factor comes in, and how do we negotiate that, especially in big decisions? Because the data could say one thing, but not everything valuable can be measured, right? There are certain very valuable things that you just have to appreciate as a human being, and that's a very difficult thing that maybe smart cities can't really answer that. Yeah.
If I may say here, it's a little bit different, because as you know very well, it's not only a city, it's a state here. And if we are not far from talking about the authority, who makes the decision, who decides to ask the people about what he thinks, and so on and so on. And it comes to me the idea that in fact a city-state is not here. It has nothing to do with the Vatican, but it has to do maybe with the origin of politics, because there were city-states. Athens was a city-state, and I've always been intrigued, and I'm not the only one, by the scales, because the scale of the birth of the political thought is a very small scale, and is a scale of a city. And here, what we can say, it could be used as an argument, or in order to find maybe a new concept, a new organization of the functions towards a new idea of democracy, a democracy which would be coming, not like a present given by the prince, but invented. And I would like to tell you a story which is completely at the opposite side of the world. But it's about, because to answer the question of being smart, it could be useful to go to the not smart, and the not smart at all. The city is Tirana. Tirana is the capital of the Albania, and Albania, you know the story, it has been the worst of what a totalitarian state could be. And after that, it was the end, and a kind of, and everything was ruined, even the mind of the people. And by chance, and nobody is talking about that, by chance, after a certain time, so it takes years, they had a mayor there called Eddie Rama, and this man is a painter formerly. His formation is and an artist, and he became the mayor of Tirana. And he did that, he decided that with friends, students in the School of Arts of Tirana. It was not difficult to ask the European authorities to furnish a lot of painting, material for painting. And they paint the city at night. But they didn't ask the people, you in this street, what color do you want? You in this house, what color? He'd say, if we would have been doing that, we would have had to mix all the colors, and the final color would have been gray, which the color we know too much. So they made a kind of coup d'etat with the colors. And after, that didn't take one night, it took time, but not so much time. So the building in front of you, it became red with yellow dots. The other one with rayures, with squares and so on and so on. In a very funny way. And he said, for me, this is what I wanted to say. And now, he said, Eddie Rama, but the poorest city in Europe is the only one where everybody is talking about colors. And that's a wonderful story, because being smart is also to invent a smart gesture. And this is the lowest level of technology, obviously. And you always, immediately you have people who say, ah yes, they painted, but with the money of the painting they could have put two more, no. But it was not only a symbol, it was really a creation and the invention of a new political possibility. And if we change of political or situation on technological level, what could be the same gesture here or there? That's what we have to think, for me. And a smart city, for me, is a city which is able to invent, to create such situations of real innovation. With technology also, obviously.
Thank you very much. I think it was a complex question. We knew it, right? It was the challenge of tonight. And we wanted to approach it through different ways, different leads, which are not the usual things you hear in Singapore. So we talked about politics, we talked about tech, we talked about people, because basically, as all of you are very user-centric and human being-centric and in your approaches. Do you have anything to add? You really would like to add tonight after this non-conclusion? Well, I think it's it's a good wrap up. Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. Can you, does anybody here, should we say thank you for this, for everybody at the Alliance Française for welcoming us, and to the embassy for organizing the talk. I hope you will have a lot of occasions to search on the web for the International Night of Idees.